Hello and welcome to what is another episode of the Fireside with Founders and Leaders podcast. I'm delighted to be joined by Leon Saunders Calvert on this week's episode. So Leon is currently Chief Product Officer at a company called ESG Book. ESG Book ultimately help provide data that can give an insight into whether a company is working towards sustainability, fixing a huge problem out there in the market for investors and other funds. Now, we talk about all sorts of things on this, including sort of Leon's journey through from the corporate world, having had lots of takeovers and buyouts, all the way through to where he is now with ESG, as well as talking about some of the challenges they face in the market of ESG, and looking at what the future of sustainable finance might be. I really hope you enjoy this one, so sit back and check it out. So hello Leon, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for taking up your time and joining on a sunny Friday afternoon of all things in September, nearly October. So look, I'd like to start by just talking a bit more about your career path, because you've worked in some pretty well-known businesses in your time. So London Stock Exchange Group, Thomson Reuters, spending quite a lot of time in these businesses. So perhaps if you can give a bit of an overview of starting off of where it all started for you in terms of where your career kicked off and moving up to where you are now with ESG.
Sure, happy to do so. So you're right, I've spent a lot of time in very large organizations, but I didn't start out that way at the very beginning of my career. And it was a choppy start to sort of land the first role. I graduated from university, and I'll give away my age. I graduated in 2001, and the markets weren't fantastic in 2001. There's a dot-com bust, and September 11th happened, and I went back and did a master's in international management, having done a first degree in a humanities subject, which was super interesting but not very vocational. And I landed at an M&A advisory boutique, which was a great training ground. Thankfully, it wasn't an M&A analyst in one of the very large investment banks where you work seemingly 22 hours a day, 7 days a week. So it's a little bit more civilized than that. But quite soon after that grounding, I moved into, I guess, what you'd now call fintech, sort of market data analytics firm. And it was a company called Merger Market. Merger Market was a VC-backed startup. Or sort of maybe scale up when I joined them. Super exciting place to be. Everyone was very young, and it meant that because everyone was very young, you could kind of find yourself in positions of responsibility quite quickly. So I found myself running, we effectively created mergers and acquisitions data, collecting data on M&A deals and intelligence on upcoming M&A deals. And I found myself running the data teams, the operations of the data teams, which included sort of setting up operations in India in order to sort of scale that process, which when you're in your mid-20s and you're running a big team, including a big India operation, super exciting. After the first sale,
quite a big thing to do at that time in your life.
It is, but it was such a young environment, such a young company. All of the management team were in their 20s. And the C-suite at the time, the founders, there were three founders, the CEO and the head of editorial and the CFO, I think were in their mid-30s. And I think we all thought they were incredibly old, which now makes me feel, just desperately old thinking about that. But we all thought they were very old at the time because it was such a young environment, a young, energetic environment. So in the context of the firm, it wasn't odd that I sort of had a lot of responsibility at that age, but I'm very grateful for it in hindsight because it's hard to come. Merger Market went on its own journey and went through sort of 3 sales, very successful process, ended up being a unicorn. I left after the first sale, and the first sale took place to the Financial Times, which at the time was owned by Pearson Group in 2006. And I left shortly after that and joined in 2007 Thomson Financial. And I thought to myself, I've just gone through this big acquisition process with Merger Market being acquired. I'm now going to join a big company, Thomson Financial. Won't have to deal with any more of that big M&A. And within a month, the merger with Reuters was announced, which was one of the largest deals in the market. And lived through that for the next few years. I was at Thomson Financial turned quickly into Thomson Reuters. And during that era, I started off in data teams running data and for, again, similar sorts of data, mergers and acquisitions data, bonds data, syndicated loans, IPOs, that kind of thing, and the league tables, which investment bankers care about so much, around how they appear on those league tables, how they rank on those league tables, and how their bonuses are affected by them. Super interesting place to be. But I was always very commercial. I wanted to move to a sort of a P&L role, for want of a better word, running a business. And I managed to sort of gear myself to do that by about 2013. And I was running the investment banking business at that point. And the investment banking business, essentially the business servicing investment bankers, so M&A bankers, capital raising bankers, equity capital markets, debt capital markets teams, with data analytics and workflow tools. So that was the business. It was a large business, and I really enjoyed that role. And I did that for a number of years until this very exciting corporate action happened with Thomson Reuters, where Thomson Reuters spun out the financial and risk division, which was about 55% of the revenue, so the majority of Thomson Reuters revenue. The financial community, if you like, was spun out to create a company called Refinitiv, what became known as Refinitiv. And I was part of that spin out. And during that time, I was asked to take over a portfolio of different businesses. One was called Lipper, which was a leading fund analysis business. One was called Starmine, which is a quant modeling business. And one was the ESG business, which when I was there, I sort of renamed to Sustainable Finance. But super interesting space, thinking about how you create ESG data to inform how capital is allocated for more sustainable outcomes, is probably the summary version of that. So collecting data on emissions, from company emissions, levels of diversity, inclusion, human rights practices, that kind of thing. Really exciting time. And then Refinitiv was acquired, having gone through this spin out and moved away from Thomson Reuters, was acquired by London Stock Exchange Group. So moved into another big corporation. And I was asked to take on running the asset management desktop business, essentially the terminal business, the data terminal business, servicing portfolio managers and buy-side analysts. And again, that was another sort of big chunky business, a bit like the investment banking business that I previously run. I had threatened myself with this idea that if I were to move to another company of my own volition, I wouldn't go and work for a direct competitor, a very large market data company, because I was very well positioned in the company that I was at. And so doing the same thing with a different logo didn't make much sense. But I was interested in, if you like, let's call it the big fish, small pond idea, a little bit more entrepreneurial. Can I go and do a C-suite role at a smaller organization? And I'd so enjoyed the ESG space, which was essentially a new market that you were having to create and mature, as well as grow the business within it. That when the opportunity to join ESG Book came up, I felt I couldn't turn it down. I knew the company. I'd partnered with the company when I was at the big corporation, so I was aware of the business. And I knew the CEO there, who, when I was running ESG at Refinitiv, the person who became the CEO of ESG Book was the head of sustainable finance at HSBC, a guy called Daniel Clear.
Right.
And so, we felt that probably in combination we could turn this thing, ESG Book, into great success. And that's the journey that I'm on now. So there we go. That's a potted history of my career, and I tell it as if it's a natural narrative, with one thing led to the next.
From one acquisition to the next, as you go, by the sounds of it, and I'd imagine that's probably something that may be on the cards, maybe for ESG further down the line. Who knows? But it seems like there's always been that sort of that view in the businesses, not necessarily directly by the impact that you're having, because obviously coming into Thomson Finance and then it merging with Thomson Reuters, but that generally tends to be the shape of things, doesn't it? Where there is some sort of merger, acquisition, as you sort of go down the line. So really interesting to hear about sort of how you've sort of followed that journey and now ended up where you are in a slightly smaller business, still focused on some of those really core aspects that you started out in when you were doing some of your studies even. So looking at that as well as a journey, and I always find it fascinating because people take so many different routes to get into product and product management. There is no what I would call traditional route as far as I see it, because as I say, people come from all different sort of walks of life. So what was it that made you feel that you wanted to get into that, obviously the C-suite role, but in product specifically over and above other things? Because you've obviously gone through sort of being in data, so you could have gone into perhaps more data-driven role, maybe an operational role, given the things that you've been doing. So what was it about product that made you choose that route and path?
Yeah. I'll answer the question. I won't avoid it, but I'll also make a comment on your earlier statement around this sort of the route of going through numerous M&A processes and things like that. You do have to adapt to change to create a career. Fundamentally, there are always those kinds of changes. Sometimes they're really big corporate changes, like big M&A deals, and sometimes those changes are just internal to the company, reorganizations. I'm not one of those people that says change is always good. That's not by default true, but you always do have to figure out what you want to do about the change that you find yourself in, and how you can make it work for yourself, and how you can turn that into a positive story for yourself. So it's not by default that change is always good, but there's always an opportunity to figure out what you want to do about that and how you want to own the narrative associated to that. Coming back to the question you asked around how to find myself in product, there's really a couple of ways into that. When I was running the businesses that I described that I was running at Thomson Reuters and Refinitiv and London Stock Exchange Group, those businesses are very, very large, and it means they tend to be quite matrix structured. And so whilst I absolutely was responsible for the revenue of those businesses and was seen as the business head, there's a lot of functions that don't directly come under you, because in a business like LSEG, there is a sales function that goes all the way up into the CEO of LSEG. And so whilst salespeople and account managers are sort of associated to the businesses that I was running, they didn't actually report directly into me. And so my point there is that there's a degree of sort of working the matrix that you have to be good at and you have to be effective at, and sort of leadership through influence in those big companies. But the one thing that is always under you in those businesses, at least in my experience, is product. Product is always under you. The responsibility to determine what is built, what is partnered on, what is built, and what we acquire. Those decisions always sit with the head of the business, even if they have to work the matrix around other functions that they need in order to execute those things. And so actually, product always being in my purview, and the desire to actually want to build something, that was always key for me, is wanting to sort of have ownership of a build which really adds value, creates value for customers and for the organization, meant that it was always a natural part of my role, even running those businesses, and was the most obvious natural fit when you think about going into a position in the C-suite where you have to sort of, as you said, choose one of those roles rather than data or head of sales or anything like that. The most obvious natural fit was the chief product officer role.
And so in terms of it being that sort of natural fit then, so was it purely based around sort of your desire to build and have a bit more ownership of that build, or were there other things that you can sort of pinpoint to say, based on your career path and the things that you'd been doing, that made it such a good fit?
So other than what I've sort of described around it being a relatively new and relatively immature market, it means that you've got some responsibilities as chief product officer around not just building products which meet very clear market needs, but actually figuring out what those market needs are and what they're likely to be, because the market's still immature, and there's actually quite a lot of education that you need to create and make and help with your customer base in order to understand, help them understand what it is that they need to drive the kind of outcomes that they want to get to. That's one of the most exciting things that I described at ESG being a really exciting place to be in. It's exciting because it's fast growing, but it also requires real strategic thinking as to what is the what is the product that you need to build. And to do that, you have to understand what are the real fundamental requirements that your customers need. In our case, we service large financial institutions who are wanting to make capital decisions which are more sustainable, right? That might be asset managers, it might be investment banks, it could be consultants, and it can even be corporates who are wanting to become more sustainable companies. But that process of enabling an understanding for them about what that really means in practice and what that looks like, and then what kind of product in terms of data analytics and workflow tools that they need, is a very exciting one, because it's not a mature market where those things are already established. You need to kind of work those through and test your hypotheses and go through a robust testing process when you build products to make sure that actually this really does fit the need, and indeed you understood the need, and that you can have the client understand the need in a way that really meets the outcomes that they're trying to drive, all of which you're all discovering together at the same time. So super interesting, super intellectually interesting, and being at the coalface of actually building this stuff is what excites me.
Nice. And so I think you sort of answered my next question there by talking about sort of having to go out and test and hypothesize and do all of that sort of stuff. But so is that the key for you then, when you're working in a market like you are, that is relatively in its infancy and relatively unexplored, to ensure that you can drive success with your customers? Because there's got to be a point of education as well with those customers, to ensure that they understand what it is that they're buying and what it is that they're doing, I'd imagine.
What it is that they need. Yeah, absolutely. I tend to have I tend to sort of operate along the following lines. In these sorts of scenarios, I mean, generally as well, but in these sorts of scenarios with these relatively new and immature markets, I tend to come up with a hypothesis pretty quickly around what I think is required, and then take it to customers or prospects in order to test it, in order to validate whether I'm right or not. Especially in these sort of relatively immature markets, if you kind of go with a blank sheet of paper and ask them what they want, they probably can't give you very good information because they're not themselves product managers, and they can't be responsible for your product strategy, if you like. But you can ask good questions around what are their needs and what are their ultimate goals and where they're trying to get to. And with that, I try and come up with a hypothesis very, very fast, which I'm not precious about, because I expect to be imperfect. I expect to have to be critiqued. But I find that by coming up with a hypothesis fast about what I think is useful and needed, people are able to give me very good feedback around why I'm wrong and why it would need to be tweaked this way or that way, or foundationally different, in order to be really commercially valuable for them, in order to really meet a requirement for them. I would suggest that whilst data and information is absolutely critical, and you want to gather lots of data and information about the market, about your customer needs, and so on and so forth, it is much better to do that with a running hypothesis, for which you are very modest about, if you like, and happy for it to be tweaked and changed and altered and critiqued, than if you go with a blank sheet of paper and just a bunch of questions. I think it will take a very, very long time before you get to the answer, and the answer will still be imperfect.
And I think you're absolutely right. It's that modesty, isn't it, of having the view to say, well, look, the hypothesis I've got is a hypothesis. It's not the perfect answer, and not being so bold as to go in and say this is what we need to do, and this is how we're going to do it. Being prepared to make those changes, listening to feedback, and doing the research ultimately.
I think that's exactly right. And there are also ways of sort of positioning those things such that you really understand whether you're likely to build something which has real commercial value. One of the things that I always sort of discuss, with my team. My team's heard me talk about this many, many times, actually, both at ESG Book and at previous companies. If you go and ask a client, would you like us to continue building this thing for you? They're never going to say no, because there's no skin in the game for them. So they don't have to. If you want to go and waste your time, and I'll look in 6 months' time about whether the thing that you built is any good for me or not, there's no downside for them to say no. So figuring out how you ask these questions in such a way which actually drive much more of a buying decision, where you actually bring them on the journey with you, and sort of try to get early commitment around either co-investing in something early, which is the ideal scenario, where they've definitely got skin in the game because they believe in the hypothesis about what needs to be built, or at least getting something very close to a pre-commitment on, if we build this, would you buy? Would you spend money on it? Would it allow you to save money on your other costs? Would it be value add enough for you if it were to meet these outcomes? Those are the kinds of questions that you really want answers on, and there are ways in to ask those kinds of questions, which is not just hey, should we carry on building this and we'll come back in 6 months' time and then you tell us if you like, because when are they going to say no? Sure, you go carry on doing your thing if you like, and then I'll come back in 6 months. Decide no, then no skin off my nose. Do you know what I mean? So it's about figuring out how you actually really establish what drives commercial value for them, and being effectively asking questions in such a way that you actually try actively to falsify your hypotheses. You want to find out why the thing that you're building wouldn't be fit for purpose for them, as opposed to trying to get validation that it will be fit for purpose, if you like. You want to find reasons why it won't be, because those are the things that will tell you what you've missed.
Perfect. That is some really solid advice to anyone sort of listening out there who's sort of going through this sort of process. So thank you for that. I'd like to sort of move on slightly to just touch upon some of the things that are happening in sort of the investing world. Especially there's a big drive, and rightly so, across the board, not just in finance, for sustainability, right? Just as everything we know. Across certainly across the UK, but across the world ultimately. And sustainable investing, as we've sort of touched upon very lightly, has become more of a thing over the course of the last sort of 10 or so years. So what have you seen as sort of some of the sustainable investing trends that have sort of happened in that time period? What's been popular, what's not worked?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I'll try and do it justice very, very quickly. There has been a mainstreaming, if you like, of sustainable investing, sustainable finance, ESG adoption, environmental, S social, G governance, ESG, the acronym that in the industry we know so well, but not everyone's familiar with it. So the adoption of ESG into financial practices, it includes things like a very significant growth in assets under management, which describes itself as being ESG focused, or integrating ESG considerations in one way, shape, or form. That sort of reached a peak in the last couple of years of equating to about a third of global assets under management in some way, shape, or form describe themselves as ESG focused, or incorporating ESG data elements, if you like, into the investment practices. So very, very significant growth. A real focus over the last few years as well from regulators who've started to regulate around both asset managers who look after people's funds and reporting on the things like the emissions trajectory of the fund. A focus on regulation on banks in terms of doing climate stress testing, understand what the climate risks are to the lending book of the bank, who are all the people you lend money to, and what's the exposure of that book to climate scenarios, and a focus on companies who are under more and more obligation to report certain non-financial data, let's call it non-financial data, broadly speaking, alongside the financial data they've been used to reporting, revenues and earnings and that kind of thing, non-financial data such as emissions, such as waste and recycling practices, such as impact on nature, as well as other social issues, human rights policies and diversity inclusion practices, that kind of thing. Demand for them to report on that, and that suite of ESG data, if you like, as metrics on companies, non-financial metrics, has developed extensively over the course of the last 5 or 10 years, but has been driven up to this point, interesting enough, by investors who demand that this is material information for them to understand in order to take investment decisions on companies, to understand their long-term sustainability criteria. But more recently, regulators have started to dictate what that kind of reporting needs to look like, both for asset managers, for investment banks, and for corporates. So there is a maturing of the market, but the market's still relatively mature. There's still a lot of regulatory overhang, and there's also a lot of dispute around what ESG really is or ought to be. Particularly in the US, ESG has been caught up in the sort of culture wars, if you like, and has been sort of weaponized in the sort of political sphere. And of course, ESG can be multiple things. It can be just non-financial data, which is used to create better performance outcomes. I give you an example of that. If you believe that the economy will decarbonize very aggressively over the course of the next 10 years as a result of policy pressures and regulatory pressures and so on and so forth, then you don't want to be invested in a company who does not have a business model which is fit for purpose for that economy of the next 5 or 10 years, because you'll find yourself invested in the equivalent of Blockbuster Video rather than the equivalent of Netflix, right? So it can be used as a non-financial data source to actually just manage better your future returns, right? And sustainable future returns. It can also be used as data inputs to actually manage impact. Actually, I might be someone who wants to invest in funds who actively are doing good for the environment, and I might even be willing to sacrifice some financial returns in order to do that, in order to drive those kind of social environmental outcomes. But again, you need data in order to be able to track that and measure that. And of course, it can be used for risk management as well. There may be all kinds of exposures that a company has in terms of, do they have good practices around how they treat their staff, and do they have good practices around how they demonstrate equality of opportunity? And if they don't, then there's actually some meaningful risk exposure for them there, which you might want to understand as an investor managing your risks, or as a bank lending money to someone who they want to make sure, is it going to be an ability to pay it back over the next 3 to 5 years, right? So the point being there that there are numerous outcomes that you might want to manage to, and there's no sort of secret one magic data point or score or anything like that which can manage to all those different scenarios. We don't treat financial data as just being, there's no magic where you can look at just one data point, a company's revenue, and know that it's going to be a really well performing stock over the next 3 years. You need lots and lots of inputs, and you need to review them in through lots of different models and with lots of different hypotheses to understand what you think those things mean. And the same is true of ESG data. At the moment, we're collecting more and more data in the market, and ESG Book is particularly at the forefront of making more and more of that transparent, and reducing opacity in the market. But there's still a level of maturity around how do we adopt that into both company practices to make more sustainable business models, and then invest in practices to invest in the companies which have those.
And just from looking at that from someone who's sort of on the outside of finance, and someone who doesn't invest in the market, if you're talking about sort of the wider world ultimately, why do you believe that it's important that, I'm assuming you believe it's important that finance companies are held accountable for their sort of ESG sort of data and tracking and reporting? But why can that be a good thing for I suppose sort of the wider globe and economy, as it were?
Yeah, sure. Let's do the simple version of that, which is the economy needs to decarbonize if we're going to reduce and mitigate the worst risks of climate change. I'll take that as a good example. And that means that you need capital to flow towards companies who are reducing global emissions, and it needs to flow away from companies who can't be part of that journey. That doesn't necessarily mean it needs to flow away from companies which are currently high emitters, so long as those companies are part of the journey of reducing emissions in a profound way towards net zero. And so we're all vested in that. We're all vested in capital flowing in the economy to the companies that are able to decarbonize and be part of the decarbonisation journey, and away from those which are not able to be part of that decarbonisation journey. I would say that it's also true, though, and I don't think that companies yet do a particularly good job of this, but it's starting to happen more and more often. It's also true that consumers, average people on the street, also want to make buying decisions around what they buy based on environmental and social criteria of the companies from whom they buy. The the brands from whom they buy.
Yep.
If you think about if you become aware that a clothes manufacturer has actually got terrible supply chain management and is using sort of child labor in emerging markets in order to create those clothes, that might affect your decision as to whether or not you buy clothes from that logo anymore, right? And so I think that's slightly less well structured for the layperson. That doesn't mean that needs to be the case. That's a part of the market immaturity, if you like. But being able to create, if you like, ESG indicators, scores, understanding for the layperson as well as for the financial market professional is an obvious next step. And there are certainly participants in the market who are sort of wanting to turn the data that we collect at the moment for sophisticated financial practitioners who are making those same kind of decisions, but figuring out how that translates into how can the consumer take advantage of this stuff too. Either way, we're all interested in it because we all need a decarbonised economy.
Yeah, we know it needs to happen, right? It's science ultimately, and you can't. Well, it's people try to. I find it difficult to argue with science ultimately. So, and we've talked a bit about ESG Book. So, how do you guys sort of leverage technology then to sort of harness all of this stuff?
Sure, ESG Book. It really has three core components to it. One is it collects a lot of that ESG data that I've just been describing on companies, right? So the same kind of data points that I've been referring to, collecting enormous amounts of data points, 350 data points or so on 10,000 companies globally, et cetera, et cetera. We also then take all that data and turn it into analytics and insights on those companies. So that includes scoring those companies based on various criteria, on their emissions management, on their waste and recycling practices, et cetera, right? So lots of different ways in which you can essentially build analytics on those companies. And we also sort of support the new regulatory overhang that I described exists in the market, both for financial practitioners but also for corporates. How do we help those people do that reporting? How do we help aggregate the data that we collect and sort of service their regulatory reporting needs? But finally, and particularly to your question around technology, ESG Book has created a technology platform which does a couple of things. One is it showcases all the data analytics that I just described to our paying customers who are able to interrogate that data and understand how companies compare with one another and inform their capital allocation processes and that kind of thing. And also for companies to benchmark themselves against other companies, how well are they performing on these things, and what do they need to do better in order to improve their sustainability across these different areas. But the other thing that we do effectively as a SaaS platform is we allow financial market practitioners, big investment banks, big asset managers, to request data via the platform from private companies who otherwise might not disclose this information. They're not public, they're not publicly listed, they don't have the same regulatory reporting burdens on this stuff. But the bank might need it because the bank might need to do its own climate stress testing and need to understand some of this data from the people it lends money to. Or the asset manager might be invested in private companies in some way, shape or form and want to understand the sustainability profile of those companies to inform its practices. And there we facilitate essentially creating a little bit more clarity and transparency in what is otherwise a very, very opaque market. There's very, very little data on private companies when it comes to ESG. And so facilitating with essentially a SaaS technology platform, that sharing of information, that community process of request and disclose of ESG data is very differentiated, very exciting, and a major part of driving transparency into the markets.
Absolutely, it's really important, I think, to sort of drive that transparency because, say, otherwise you're not going to know whether people are being truly sustainable in terms of the way that they're operating, and are they the future or are they the past? As we said sort of earlier, that comparison between sort of blockbusters and Netflix really, and that is not just for investment purposes, but for understanding as are these companies that you want to be purchasing from or interacting with, even as consumers at that level.
That's absolutely right. And from a product management perspective, if I bring it back to that view, that means we've got a particular opportunity, and all opportunities come with challenges. And that is, we've got both a lot of data, which we need to figure out how we make available to the right people in the right way. How do we create the right kind of visualization of that data, the right kind of tools to interrogate that data, to allow for some of the decision making that I've described. But we've also got, almost distinctly, although we do absolutely, there's ability for those two things to leverage each other, but almost distinctly a SaaS platform, which is effectively enabling of new data, enabling new data collection. And that's almost a different business model. One of those business models is selling data and analytics, which you've already collected. And the other business model is allowing for the collection of new data, which doesn't yet exist today. And so, we've certainly given ourselves a nice challenge at ESG Book, but also one which is being met very, very well by the markets, because we're solving a particular problem here, which is meaningful and which exists, and which no one has quite got their arms around before now.
That's perfect, and that's exactly the way you want to do it. Ultimately, from a product perspective, is solving a problem, and that's the way that you can actually build things out. So, good to see that you're moving in that direction, and yeah, absolutely solving a problem that is a real problem. One of the final things I wanted to ask you, Leon, is what do you see as, I suppose, the future of sustainable finance? Where's it going?
God, that's a big question, isn't it? Let's see if I can do that justice. I think a couple of a couple of things, and I'll try and keep it brief. One of which is the ongoing maturity of the market requires effectively all financial institutions to factor in these considerations into company valuation models, into decision-making models around how capital is allocated and how companies are valued throughout the entire financial community. At the moment, ESG is still, if you like, a specialist or a quasi-niche area, which is taken very, very seriously and is taken seriously by the financial markets and by regulators. But there's still a degree to which you have ESG experts sort of in the corner who do a lot of the heavy lifting, in a lot of these big companies. It's not yet sort of standard practice to incorporate the carbon emissions and the cost of those carbon emissions into the balance sheet of a company to inform the valuation of that company. And that's the natural progression. The natural progression is that all analysts, investment banking analysts, asset management analysts, incorporate these considerations as a matter of course in the way that they already do with financial data. And in some scenarios, there may be it may make trivial differences to the decisions they make around capital allocation. In other scenarios, it may make very, very meaningful differences in the decisions that they make. But the point being, it needs to be integrated into the mainstream of those workflows of the financial markets. The second thing is something you touched on, which is how do you actually turn that data, which is at the moment very, very detailed and requires a degree of sophistication and interrogation of that data, into something which is easy for the consumer to make sense of, and such that people who just want to visit their IFA occasionally to look at their pension funds and how their pensions are doing, without necessarily wanting to have to choose stocks and pick companies and so on and so forth, but they just want to understand, how's my pension doing? And by the way, can I understand it through the lens of how aligned to a net zero economy are my investments in my pension? That's also part of what I would describe as sort of mainstreaming the ESG into all financial practices. And so it does actually affect consumers and if you like, people with a very layperson review into investments, such as through their pensions or their savings, things like that, and they can understand their savings and their pensions through the lens of ESG. That's the direction of travel. That's what's happening.
Perfect.
But of course, it takes a little while to get to that full maturity.
Yeah, it all takes time, and especially when you're talking about a market that is heavily regulated, such as finance, it tends to find that things do move slowly for the right reasons, often, sometimes not. But it seems like we're moving in the right direction of travel, and I think that it seems like most people, companies are all on board with sort of taking us in this direction, which is only a positive thing. So, well, thank you so much for giving up your time today. It's been super useful and insightful hearing more about sort of ESG and how you've been involved and how you've been involved in products. So, yeah, really, really appreciate you taking your time out of your day to talk to me about it.
Great to chat, Rupert, as always.